Hello class, and welcome to the COMP-111 Exam 1 Study Guide Review. So what I'm going to do is I have this study guide here, and this is available for you to download and to use in preparation for the Exam 1. I'm just going to run through this study guide very quickly, kind of walk you through the things that you can expect to find on the exam. Now, the first exam covers all of the materials from week 1 through the end of week 6. Now, week 6 is not going to be focused on a lot, so the primary focus will be on weeks 1 through weeks 5. So in order to prepare, you want to definitely go back over all the readings for week 1 through week 6, review the key points for on modules 1 through 6, and then also review your homework from weeks 1 through 6. All of those would be great. Another useful study guide would be the PowerPoints. Downloading the PowerPoints from weeks 1 through week 6 also will help to identify to you key topics, definitions, how things are accomplished, those sorts of things, all right? The exam format, at this point the exam is still a paper and pencil exam. You're not permitted a book or notes when you're taking the exam, so you'll just take your writing utensil and that would be it. The exam itself is going to be comprised of true-false, 10 or so true-false questions, 10 or so multiple choice questions, and then 10 to 15 short answer and coding questions of various point assignments. Now, on the exam, I provided you here, well, for the exam review, I provided you here some practice questions that you can use to prepare for the exam. I will say that these exams are very challenging, so you definitely want to go in well prepared for the exam. And you're permitted, it's either 2.5 or 3 hours to take the exam. Whether you need all of that time or not will depend upon how well you are prepared when you go into the exam. All right, so from Chapter 1, the focus is on the generics of programming. So the CPU, a little bit on the computer, CPU, what are the various operations, what's the difference between primary and secondary storage, and what would be an example of each, you know, what's an algorithm versus what's pseudocode, flowcharts were also discussed in there, syntax versus logic errors. Apparently, the basic operations of a CPU is very important because I included it in twice. The 2 important benefits of the Java language, the file extension for a Java source file and the file extension for a compiled Java file, and how do you go about compiling or calling a Java executable from the command line. So if you want to know what those extensions are, you could actually go out to BlueJ, take a look at the files you've created, which is a Java source file, which is a compiled file, and so you can see what those file extensions are. All right, I'm actually going to just delete this while I'm in here. All right, and then output statement. So basically analyzing some code. Word the value of hello, second word the value of study, third word the value of hard. We're concatenating those together, and what would be our output? Okay, make sure when you're looking at these you're following exactly what is written. You're not assuming anything. You're saying this is exactly what the code contains, so this is exactly what the output is going to be. Don't assume, oh, they forgot a space, or oh, they forgot a period, or they forgot something. Exactly what is written. All right, here's some more code. Hello, study hard again, and we've got some errors that we've introduced in here. So there's 3 syntax errors, there's 2 logic errors. So where would those errors be? So you could expect to be given some code, and it would be your job to identify where the syntax errors are and where the logic errors are. And then the difference between a system versus the system.out.print methods. Okay, so these 2 methods, they both provide output onto the console, which is great, but how do they differ? Like, what does the system.out.print line do versus what does the system.out.print do? Okay, and then the purpose of a compiler versus the purpose of a processor. So those would be the things from Chapter 1 that you could expect to find on the exam. All right, Chapter 2, we got into constructors. We talked about default or empty constructors and explicit constructors. So what is the purpose of a constructor? What's the difference between a default constructor versus an explicit constructor? And what return type is specified for a constructor? Now, given these following definitions for constructors, these would be the public statement of a constructor. How would you create a new object instance from this? So you're not writing the constructor itself, you're calling the constructor to create a new object instance. So what would you do in these particular situations to call that particular constructor to create a new object instance? And keep in mind, these items here are just for your information to let you know that you should be providing a string value, and an integer value. These variables in make, in color, and in MPG are not available to you. They're just informational only. They exist in the class, not here where you're actually calling the constructor. Okay, so you can't reference those particular variables unless you specifically identify those variables, declare those variables in your code itself. All right, and the same with our house down here with latitude, longitude, and color. These are just telling you you need to provide a double value, and a string value, but you don't have these physical variables available to you. They exist in the class, but they don't exist when you're calling this particular constructor. All right, here we have a statement, my account dot deposit, open paren, paycheck, close paren. So you're asked, like, what's the object in this particular statement? What's the method? And what's the parameters if there are any? And so it's asking you how many total parameters are there if you added your implicit and explicit together. Is there an implicit parameter? And if it is, what is it? Is there an explicit parameter? And if there is, what is that? Okay. Other things that were talked about in Chapter 2, the Java identifier, we talked about primitive data types, and then we identified, like, how would you know which data type to apply. So here I've given you a list of different types of data, and what would be the data type that we should use for this? You know, like for a GPA, grade point average, what data type should we use? For name, for age and years, customer address, those sorts of things. So you should be able to look at different types of data and say, okay, this is the data type we would use, that's the data type we would use. All right, here's some code where we're creating two different objects. And so it's asking you how many objects are created. Are the instance variables referred to by new card the same instance variable referred to by new car 2? All right, so you're looking at this. Am I creating, and so basically what this is asking you is, am I creating two completely different objects, or am I creating just one object that has two names to point to it? So you need to look at this and determine that. And if they're the same object, then the instance variables are the same. If they're two completely different objects, then the instance variables will be different. And then here again, we're doing the same thing. We've switched the code up a little bit, and we're asking the same question, how many objects were created? So again, you need to identify, are we creating two completely different objects, or are we creating one object with two variables pointing to it? And then that will influence your answers. All right, here's another statement. Public void deposit has an explicit parameter of n amount with data type double. All right, so would you assume that this is an accessor or a mutator method, and how could you tell? Remember, an accessor method accesses data but does not change it, where a mutator method would change the values of your instance variables. And does this method return a value? If it does, what's the data type? Does it accept explicit parameters? If it does, what are the data types of those parameters? All right, here you're given a bunch of print statements. What's going to be the output? And notice it is flipping print, print line, print line, and those behave slightly differently. So your output, it may not be, it's not as straightforward as that. You need to pay attention to which print method is being used to know exactly what your output would be. All right, and here we've given you some different variable names, and your job is to say, do they violate the Java syntax? Remember, there's specific rules when you're naming variables, and if you violate the syntax, then those rules will call a compiler error. But there's also Java conventions. So a Java convention will correctly compile, but it's not appropriate. It's not what Java programmers use. So some of these may violate both. Some of them may be fine syntax-wise, but violate the convention, and then vice versa. Some may be invalid syntax-wise, but be fine for the convention. All right, chapter 3. So define abstraction, encapsulation, information hiding, and black box. What is a unit test? What are Java docs? How are Java docs created? And what parameters can be specified for a Java doc? What's a local variable? What's the lifetime of that local variable versus an instance variable and the lifetime of an instance variable? How are implicit parameters denoted within a class? So when we're referring to instance variables inside a class, we put this special keyword in front that tells us that that belongs to the implicit parameter. So what's that keyword that we stick in there? If you're looking at these following statements, how many parameters, both implicit and explicit, are in each of these statements? So if we were to look at this statement here, how many parameters? Is there any? What if we looked at this statement or this statement or this statement? Oh, it says assuming this, so not the statement, but looking at each one of these statements, how many implicit and how many explicit parameters are in each one of these statements? And the basic steps for testing a method. So, when we're testing a method, we're definitely going to create our object, we're going to call the method that we're testing, and then we're going to check to make sure that it functioned the way that we're expecting. So you need to know those steps. You also need to know the basic steps for testing a constructor. So testing a constructor, you need to call the constructor that you're testing to create your object, assert that it's not equal to null, and then check each of your instance variables, each one. You can't just check one of them, you need to check all of them to make sure they contain the value that you're expecting. And then likewise, how do you write the assert statements to test the methods that return an integer value, a double value, or a string value? In chapter 4, we got into some mathematical computations. So here we have an increment and a decrement. And so we're assuming A is equal to 10, B is equal to 11, and we have C equals A plus B plus plus. So what is A going to be equal to when the statement's done? What is B going to be equal to? And what is C going to be equal to? Now, it's really important to remember that if your increment or decrement falls in front of the variable, you do the increment or decrement first, and then you complete your calculation. But if it falls behind the variable, you do the calculation first, and when the calculation is complete, then you do your increment and decrement. So in this case, we would add A equals 10 plus B equals 11, so we would come up with 21. So C is going to contain a value of 21, and then when we're all done, we're going to increment B, and then B will have a value of 12. Okay, constants. So what does the final keyword do when you're defining variables? What does the static keyword do when you're defining variables? And how would you go about defining a constant variable with the name of mins per hour, setting it equal to the constant value of 60? What's an implicit parameter or an instance variable, and should it be manipulated by directly accessing it, and what's the lifetime of that instance variable? Here we have an equation. What would be the result of this equation? And we can see in here a couple things are going on that you'd want to remember. We have the modulus, which returns the remainder, not the result of the division, and we have integer division going on as well. So if you're presented with a mathematical computation, you want to make special note first of the order of precedence. So you're doing parentheses, exponent, multiplication, division, modulus, and addition and subtraction. So you want to make sure you keep that in mind. And then you also want to keep in mind any integer division and any modulus that's occurring. All right, here we're assigning some statements. We're defining their data types and assigning them different values, and the question is, will they compile or will they not compile? Okay, here you're giving these two statements, and then you're asked some questions. What will this value contain? What's the first index position? Okay, so what's the value contain, and will an error result? Here, what's the first index position of a string? So we're getting into the substring, the string methods and modules. Okay, and then in this format, the substring, dot substring, open paren integer, comma integer. So in that basic format of the substring, what's the first explicit parameter represent? What's the second explicit parameter represent? And what element is the first element position in a string? So we're kind of asking the same question twice. Using the substring, how would you return just the first character of a string or just the last character of the string? How would you remove the first character from a string and remove the last character of a string? So how would you go about using the substring to do that? All right, you're given some sample code, and then you're asked to identify the object, the method, and the parameter. And again, implicit parameters, explicit parameters, output of these statements. What would be the result of this concatenation? So what would be our output from the statement? And then how is input received from the console? What object needs to be declared? How do you get integer, double, string data? What method is used to receive just a single word versus what method is used to receive an entire line? So that would be chapter 4. And into chapter 5, we have comparison operators. So what would we use to compare two integer values versus what would we use to compare to double values? When should you not use the equal comparison operator, and what should you use instead? So in strings or in objects, remember, we're not going to use a comparison operator. We need to use the specific modules or methods that are used for comparison. Can you use the equals equal operation to compare to floating point or double values? And the answer for that, of course, is no, because Java takes these values out to infinite decimal places, right? And so two double values may come back not being equal, even though as far as we're concerned, they are equal. So you want to subtract two values and take the absolute value of the result of that subtraction and then compare it to some epsilon value. So for instance, if you're okay, as long as these two values are in a decimal place, then you would subtract the one from the other, take the absolute value, so it's always positive, and then say as long as the result of this subtraction is less than 0.00001, then as far as I'm concerned, they're equal. Okay. What's the purpose of an if statement? Evaluate this. Is this a value or a valid statement? Will it successfully compile? Why or why not? Take a look at this statement. What's going to be printed if the input is equal to R? What if the input's equal to T? What if it's equal to Q? What's going to be our output? All right, here's another statement, quote 1 dot compared to quote 2. So what would be returned if the two statements or two objects are equal? What if quote 1 comes alphabetically before quote 2? What if quote 2 comes alphabetically before quote 1? What values are returned? And then truth tables. So assuming P is true and Q is false and R is true, what would be the result of each one of these equations? And then here's just some sample programming. So write the code to test the gender of an employee, printing male if the employee has a gender of M, and female if the employee has a gender of F. Print unknown if it's neither M nor F. So you're going to write the code to test these different things. And so they're telling you that there's a get method called getGender, which returns a data type of character. All right, write the code to test the age of an employee. So use the getAge method to retrieve the age and then print out the following. So these are a bunch of if, then, else type statements that you're doing. How are unit test and test-driven development generally developed, and when should they be developed? Like, should they be developed after you've written all your code, before you've written your code, while you're in the process of writing your code? So just test-driven development. So these are the basic components. These are different questions, different concepts, different topics that you can expect to find on this first exam. So I really encourage you to take this study guide and to work through it, referring to your PowerPoints, referring to your reading, referring to the homework. Really work through this, and this will ensure that you're very well prepared for that first exam.